The third article of the Apostles' Creed reads, I believe in the Holy Spirit and the Holy Catholic Church, the communion of saints, the forgiveness of sins, the resurrection of the body, and the life everlasting. So what comes right after the Holy Spirit is the church. We need to see the church following the Holy Spirit because the church is the work of the Holy Spirit. The Nicene Creed expands that claim in saying, we believe one holy Catholic apostolic church. Various claims we're going to be unpacking in the material that we visit on what the church is. But before we get there, here's what I want to do for the rest of our time today. I want to look at some challenges to this picture. The Christians have been saying this for 2,000 years, more or less, either implicitly or explicitly. But in a way, this is a difficult passage to speak when you're saying the creed. This is actually the one that furrows the most brows and wrinkles the most noses when people see it and say, the Holy Catholic Church, do I really want to say that? Does that really belong in the creed? Shouldn't we just talk about God and leave the rest out? Part of that's the Protestant legacy, but the Protestant legacy was way more pro-church than a lot of contemporary Christians are. John Calvin said, you can't have God as your father unless you have the church as your mother. And that was John Calvin who said that. What's happened to leave us feeling as ambivalent as we do about the church? I'm going to describe several challenges. The first one I'm going to call the historicist challenge. It comes from a kind of empiricism in our culture that only wants to believe what's outward, manifest, confirmable, visible. Our historicist framework leads us to want to qualify that claim and say, well, you know, what history really shows us is an overlapping, interlaced stream of traditions. We see churches, but I don't know if we see one church. We see traditions that are influenced by one another, that change over time, that are always in flux, that are always mingling with their cultures and reacting against their cultures and changing with the times. It becomes difficult to speak of the one church in that, when you've been trained in that framework. Let me give you another challenge. I'm going to call it the modern challenge, or the challenge of individualism. I start with my own inner private experience to know what's real, and then I try to think, okay, so I understand that I'm real, right? I think, therefore I am. What are you guys? Are you people at all, or are you the matrix? Now, those kinds of problems arise following René Descartes, who posed them because he wanted to think inside out. He wanted to think from what you can know for certain outward to what is less sure. So our culture has trained us to think inside out. I mean, ironically, we can't because we're outside in. I mean, I can't think except with words, and the words that I think in, I didn't invent. They're called English. And I grew up in them. The world came alongside me and came up from behind me. I was born in the middle of it. You know, I didn't invent the world. But I'm trained to think as if I do. And my real authentic relationship with God is a private relationship with God. It's not one mediated through this outside world that I can't really trust. It's not mediated through organized religion, through external structures like institutions, rituals. We've been trained by our culture to be suspicious of others and suspicious of structures, institutions, way more than we're suspicious of ourselves. We've been trained to put our profoundest trust in ourselves. When you're trained in a world like that, it becomes very difficult to understand why the church is in the creed. Doesn't it? If that weren't enough, there's another one. which I'm going to call the consumeristic challenge. This doesn't go back to the 1600s. This is something that's coming later with the Industrial Revolution and with the availability of mass prosperity and mass consumption, which has trained us to think of ourselves as consumers. We think of ourselves as buyers and sellers of stuff that's made to please us, to meet our needs and to meet our desires. All right? Our culture is consumeristic. It's been pointed out to you, I'm sure, many times that most of the information that you receive in our society is advertising in either an explicit or an implicit way, which has been telling you and me the story that who we are is what we buy or sell or have or wear or use. Relationships become means of acquisition that meet our desires. And we're going to evaluate them accordingly. So you live in a world like that, where your identity is something that you construct out of style, out of stuff. What is the church going to turn into? Well, the church turns into a place where your needs are met. The church turns into a place where you can identify with the style there or you don't identify with the style there. And what are you going to do if your church isn't meeting your needs? Well, you're going to shop for another one, aren't you? Your church relationships are as dispensable as your operating system. If it no longer meets your needs, if it no longer feeds you, you find one that does. It's not an organic place with relationships whom God has joined together for mutual edification, for building up according to His mission. I hear this from students. Aren't denominations here so that we have different styles of worship so that we can find the place that meets our needs? No, that wasn't the Protestant Reformation, folks. Luther wasn't like, the Catholic thing just isn't really working for me. I need another kind of worship music. I mean, we've rewritten the past. That might be what denominations are turning into in a consumeristic environment. But it's really not even what denominations are turning into. It's what churches are turning into. If you're in this demographic group, if you're in this subculture, if you're from this ethnicity, go to this church where you'll like it. That's what consumerism is turning us into. And with that kind of narrative, it's hard to say with true conviction, I believe in the Holy Catholic Church. I believe in the holy, universal Church of Jesus Christ. So, in a way, this part of Christian doctrine is hard for us to understand and hard for us to maintain because we are swimming upstream when we do it. The currents of our culture are making it harder and harder to maintain this. And in the time remaining, I just want to show you a different picture. Jesus' picture. Jesus didn't treat the church as any of these things. Jesus put the church at the top of his priorities after only the Father. And because the church was the Father's priority, it wasn't a conflict. He didn't write a gospel so that we would have his story just the way he wanted it. You know what? He trusted his people to tell his story. Can you imagine? We don't have the gospel according to Jesus in our New Testaments. He trusted his people. That's why we have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. He could have written a systematic theology. He could have told us about the Trinity and about incarnation and saved a lot of centuries in doing so, but he didn't bother. He trusted his people. The most pressing issue in the first century was a theological issue. Do Gentiles need to be circumcised? Do they need to take on the Torah? And there's no word from Jesus directly speaking to that. And it's not like he didn't see it coming, because he's dealing with Greeks and Samaritans and centurions during his ministry. He trusted his people to figure it out, and they did in the book of Acts. And when they get together to debate the issue, no one at that council in Acts 15 can give a saying from Jesus that speaks directly to the issue, because there wasn't one. Instead of all those pronouncements that he could have made but didn't, he invested in his disciples. He spent those months or years putting together a fellowship of witnesses and arranging them in relationships of accountability and love and responsibility. So I think the biggest challenge to the first three challenges I've given you is Jesus himself. The church is of fundamental importance in the New Testament. It's of fundamental importance in Jesus' own ministry. And so we're going to spend weeks talking about it in this class, because it needs to be of fundamental importance to us if we're going to be learning Christian doctrine. So that's where we're going next.